Good afternoon. Welcome to the Pathways 2.0 Journey to Excellence Through Literacy, the Pilot Teacher webinar. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to teach your children. We pray that this webinar will be beneficial to those pilot teachers that will be implementing a unit of Pathways 2.0. Thank you for all your blessings, and we ask that you will continue to be with each one of us and the schools that we represent and work in. We ask this in thy name. Amen.
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 So just a logistical feature before we start. To the right of your screen, you see that there is a chat box. Please post any questions that arise during the course of the webinar if you need clarification on something, and at the end we'll allow a few minutes to respond to those questions. So the purpose of the webinar, let's begin by articulating that, is for you that have been identified by either your union or conference to participate in this pilot to use the HEROES units across the grade levels, of course depending upon what grade levels you teach, in your classroom at the very beginning of the year. Now the purpose of implementing and piloting this first unit is to give us some idea as to the effectiveness of this webinar you're actually participating in right now. Are we providing sufficient information to you to implement the Pathways 2.0 program in this webinar? That's the type of information and feedback we'll be looking for. So a little bit more about that and the survey that we'll administer at the end of this webinar. So we'll circle back to the purpose and clarify.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
And clarify any questions that might arise regarding your implementation. So the journey for Pathways 2.0 began several years ago, and some of the documents that were developed prior to the writing of the DLGs we'll share with you this afternoon. We have employed 4 writers, Adventist classroom teachers that are working full-time to write the DLGs over a 2-year time period. And so they're about midway through that process, will complete their work next summer, with the goal of full implementation being the school year of 2019-20. So that's sort of the big picture in terms of full implementation. On the screen you see the contents of our webinar for this afternoon, and we're going to have 4 different presenters, and let me introduce them. Myself, I'm Carol Campbell, Director of Elementary Education from the North American Division. I'll be sharing some of the topics with you. We have Lou Ann Howard, who has been chairing our Pathways 2.0 committee. She's Director of Education for the Mid-America Union. Patty Revelinsky, who is an Associate Director for Elementary Education in the North Pacific Union, and she's been part of the Development Committee as well. And Cindy Patton, who is has spent many years as a classroom teacher in our system, and she is reviewing the DLGs as they are submitted by the writers. And so each of these individuals have had ample experience with this new program and will be sharing their expertise with you in terms of the topics that you see on the screen right now. Next. So today I'm going to be sharing with you specifically these particular topics. I provided a little bit of an introduction already, but specifically I'm going to talk about faith connections and their significance for providing a framework. If you could go back to the former slide, please, for a minute. In addition to faith connections, I will talk about the 4 shifts that apply to our standards, and then just how big ideas and essential questions also help frame the curriculum for Pathways 2.0. Next. So let's begin by saying that this is a biblically based curriculum. There's a quote here from Christ's Object Lessons that I'd just like for us to pause and read and think about for a moment. In making a profession of faith in Christ, we pledge ourselves to become all that it is possible for us to be as workers for the Master, and we should cultivate every faculty to the highest degree of perfection, that we may do the greatest amount of good of which we are capable. This, in part, is our goal for our learners, for our students. We have mission statements that state, in essence, that we're preparing our learners for work in this world as well as for eternity. And we want that to be a work of excellence. Thus, we continue to use the byline, Journey of Excellence through Literacy, for this particular program. So we're focused on excellence. Academic rigor is part of that, as well as being a biblically based curriculum. It's standards-based. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a moment, with an emphasis on, just how we can be of service to others. Also, we're acknowledging the significance of diversity within the program. So all of these factors are things that have been taken into consideration as this program has been developed. Next. So let's circle back to the topics that I'm speaking to. And first of all, faith connections. This will be a familiar image to you as you work your way through different DLGs in this program. It's based on the Adventist worldview. You will find that we're using the Bible as a standard for learning and living a life of faith. And this is our conceptual tool or framework for teaching and learning. So let's talk about this image for just a moment. In the Adventist worldview, we've broken it up into 4 conceptual quadrants: creation, fall, redemption, and recreation. And our goal is for students and learners to be able to articulate these 4 concepts and apply them to the interpretation or creation of text, whether they're reading, writing, speaking, or listening. And so for each DLG, you will find this image reproduced in the front, and it will take on the content within each quadrant will take on the content in terms of the particular theme. We're maintaining the same 9 themes in the program as we've had previously, and the worldview visual such as this will apply specifically to that particular theme. The one you see on the screen is the one that you will find in the Heroes DLG that you will be piloting, and it is the same visual across the grade levels. So we're calling it a faith connections chart, and it connects to the theme with the 4 different concepts in the quadrants. All right, next. There are significant shifts in this program from our current Pathways program, and they're reflected in our standards document, which has also served as a framework. So we have our Adventist worldview, and then we have our standards that serve as a second type of framework for this program. So let's look at the 4 general shifts in terms of the content and the curriculum. Number 1, academic or regular and supported practice with appropriately complex texts and their academic language. A real focus on teaching explicitly academic language, and then finding that academic language embedded within texts that have been identified due to their complexity. And there'll be some information in the teacher's manual regarding measuring complexity. We won't go into that feature right now, though. Number 2, reading, writing, listening, and speaking grounded in evidence from text, both literary and informational. So we want students to analyze what they read or view or hear and be able to support their views on different topics. Number 3, knowledge is built through a content-rich nonfiction. We've created more or less a 50-50 ratio of narrative and informational texts in terms of the anchor text for each of the DLGs, and we've been very intentional about this. About 1/3 of the titles are new from the previous Pathways program or the current program. And number 4, focus on speaking and listening. Very intentional about teaching to these standards for speaking and listening, because we know that they impact comprehension, and collaboration is a key feature of these particular standards. So just a general overview of some ways in which this program is shifting from the past or the current program. All right, next, let's look at how these features are embedded in the components of the program. We have our standards, which serve as a framework for curriculum instruction and assessment. And you'll be hearing more and more about standards-based teaching and learning as we move forward. Then we have a teacher's manual. There will only be one teacher's manual or teacher manual for this program, and it's in the development stage right now. And then you have 3 visuals here on the screen that are covers for particular DLGs. And then we have a list of the anchor texts. Little fine print you can't read, but we'll be glad to share that list with you if you desire to have a heads up on what the anchor texts are for each of the themes across the grade levels. And then there will be writer's handbooks as well. All right, next. One last feature that serves as a framework as well for the program, or what we call essential questions and big ideas. I think most of you are familiar with that terminology, but let's just look at a definition for each. Essential questions engage learners in making meaning and deepening their understanding. And here's an essential question from the HEROES unit. Big ideas, they state what skilled performers will need in order to effectively transfer their learning to new situations. And here's a sample of a big idea. And the essential questions and big ideas are articulated across the grade levels for each of the themes. And so you will find this essential question and big idea across the grade levels for the theme of HEROES. So those are 3 ways in which we have framed the curriculum: faith connections, and essential questions, big ideas, and the standards themselves, which, as we've gone through, some significant shifts that have been made in the standards document. All right, I will turn the screen over now to Patty, who's going to share with us some further information about the topics that you see on the screen.
So we're going to look at the scope and sequence grade bands. That will give you an idea of what the content is going to be for each of the grade levels as the writers are doing their work. We're also going to briefly talk about multi-grade, but Cindy will be covering that more in her subject topic area as well. Next slide. The scope and sequence covered word study, which is vocabulary, phonological awareness, phonics and spelling, which is for grade 1, and then word work and spelling for grades 2 through 8. Reading workshop. There are specific lessons for whole group instruction, and you can see the bullets underneath small group instruction and independent work. Then in the area of writing workshop, you can see that there will be an emphasis on writing. Handwriting is not going to be included in this program. We are suggesting that the school utilize a handwriting program for all of their grades so that they have a common content, but that would be selected by you, or perhaps your conference has some information on that as well. And then grammar. The one thing that we learned from the original pathways was being more intentional about the specific content. And so the lessons that we're going to look at will identify specifically what you're going to be teaching on a particular day in the area of writing or grammar. Next slide. Here you see a sample of what has been given to the writers as far as the scope and sequence. The pink band, which is kind of in the center of the page, is reflective of writing lessons. And on the far left, you'll see a 1:2, that's first month, second week. So you can see that, and this happens to be reflective of 5 through 8. So the first column, Lesson 2 description, is going to be for 5th grade. Lesson 2, personal narrative, will be 6th grade, and then 7th and 8th are going to work on descriptive essays. There were many times when there could be a connection between 5th and 6th, or 7th and 8th, and the same with 3rd and 4th. It happened less frequently for grades 1 and 2. So therefore, we are recommending that if you have a 1st and 2nd grade combination, that you teach 1st grade their material and 2nd grade their material. That might change as we get into more experience in using the programs. Teachers are always very good about finding what works for them. But when Cindy talks about the daily lesson guides, you'll notice that there is information for 3rd and 4th within a particular lesson guide, if in fact you're teaching those 2 grades together. So hopefully this is going to assist with the multi-grade teachers. Next slide. So just to show you the connection between the scope and sequence and the daily lesson guide. This is a sample from 7th and 8th. It happens to be day 3 for the writing workshop. Now during the first week of school, or the first week that you're using this material in the first month, there's going to be specific pre-assessment lessons outlined. And this happens to be one of those writing mini lessons. And if you speed read through, you'll notice down on the bottom right column, the last bullet says, this is what you can use for grade 7. It's in the appendix. And then there's a note. If you need that information for grade 8, you can see where it's located. So the intent is to make the learning and the instructions to the teacher more specific, and knowing that the teachers that have the language arts skills, they will know what to adapt and how it fits their style. But maybe the teachers that aren't as familiar with language arts instruction, they will have prescriptive lessons that they can follow. Next slide.
I am going to talk a little bit about the anchor text and then about the curriculum and instruction and how we look at pacing. Here is a little bigger description of the anchor texts. The anchor texts were chosen mostly to have authentic, complex texts that anchors the instruction. They will mostly be used in the mini lessons for the whole group instruction in reading. Now you can see there's some titles, you may be able to see there's some titles that are bolded here on this list. Those are the titles that have been changed. We have titles that have been changed or that are new. We also have some titles that are just placed differently. So for instance, if you look under yesterday in grade 2, you will see Charlie Horse. In the old Pathways, that was a hero's title. So we just tried to do better placement of them. And some books have moved from one grade level to another because we felt it was much better to be taught at a different grade level. And so you may see those kind of changes, but the books will be the same. Approximately a third of the titles were changed. Actually 26 titles in grades 1 through 8 were changed throughout all of those. We looked again at text complexity, we looked at lexile ranges, and then what the text actually said as considerations and how complex it was. In addition to having the anchor text, you will find in each daily lesson guide a paired text. The paired text is an authentic text on a similar topic that the students use with the anchor text to construct meaning from the text. Those paired texts might be a newspaper article or a magazine article, might be a piece snippet from a diary or a letter, a picture, a chapter from a book. They can vary. If you're asked to use a book for a paired text, you only need one copy of that book. You do not need a copy for every student. And so that is a little bit on our anchor text and where we're headed there and our paired texts. When we looked at the curriculum, the curriculum in Pathways 2.0 is designed to reflect the intentions of rigor articulated in the standards, and it's built upon some critical assumptions. First, that the curriculum is invitational, allows for active student engagement, and ensures that rigorous learning occurs. Next, that the literacy learning leads to change in attitudes, hopes, and living. That academic achievement is strengthened as the knowledge gap is reduced. And that narrative texts are better to understand. Humanity understands itself best through narrative texts. We also look at having scaffolded instruction so that we can meet the complex nature of learners and learning. Learning experiences must reflect evidence-based principles of practice, and learning occurs as a result of an interaction between prior experiences, motivational factors, subject matter, methodology, and resources. So that's what led us as we developed the curriculum. And then as we looked at instruction, we know first that Jesus is the master teacher. His model of joy, tenderness, sympathy, humility, and discernment of infinite possibilities serves as an inspiration to Adventist teachers. The goal of instruction is to nurture the dispositions of excellence, critical thinking, and lifelong learning. And here you will see several tenets that led us to have priorities for the instructional design and the implementation of pathways. It's a cyclical model, cultivating independent learning, creates a sense of community where students are actually engaged in their learning, more of a collaborative setting between the teachers and the learners. Our skills are taught explicitly and systematically. There's meaningful, authentic, accountable discussion. There's inquiry, balanced instruction, professional development to inform our instructional practices is key. And then we need to have a continuous process of reflection, application, and growth. When we look at pacing, how we're going to do that, we have 3 instructional blocks. This screen shows us the instructional block for grades 1 and 2, where we would spend around 30 minutes in specific word study activities. Vocabulary, which is both vocabulary for the anchor text and some academic vocabulary, focusing on word sorts and also having a word study notebook. Phonics, which covers phonological awareness and phonics, and there are specific lessons written into the DLG for that. And spelling, which again is looking on the word sort way of learning your spelling. Then 70 to 90 minutes will be focused on reading for grades 1 and 2, some whole group instruction, your shared reading, interactive read aloud, comprehension mini lessons will happen there. Small group instruction for 70 minutes, the heart of it, where you have guided reading, and why there are not specific guided reading lessons in the DLGs, we are asking you to choose a guided reading program such as Reading A to Z and utilize their method of doing guided reading. Literacy centers will be a part of the small group instruction and independent reading. And then in writing and language, that will be 40 minutes, 10 minutes for a mini lesson and 20 minutes for practicing writing, and then another 10 minutes for your handwriting program. We have built in every day there will either be a writing mini lesson or a grammar mini lesson, and then there will also be time for independent writing. You will see a similar system for grades 3 to 8. The timing is a little different, the focus is a little different, but it is basically the same as you see here, where you will have word study, reading workshop, and writing workshop, covering some of the same ideas in those. Carol?
All right, so let's talk a little bit about assessment. Luann has noted some really critical principles for curriculum and instruction. And so assessment needs to guide what we do in terms of this new program as well. There are some critical attributes that we took into consideration when we looked at developing assessment pieces for this program. And before we proceed to the next slide, I just want to highlight several of those in general. First of all, assessment needs to inform instruction. It needs to be a critical part of our instructional process. And so we took that in consideration when we developed the assessments for the program. It also needs to be tied to our standards. And it needs to be ongoing and timely. And we need to have multiple measures, no one assessment. We should base our evaluation of a student's progress on just one measure. We need multiple measures. And then another critical thing to think about, and I'll circle back to this in a minute, is the nature of teacher feedback as part of this whole process, and student leading and scaffolding their feedback so students can self-assess themselves. So just some critical principles that we took into consideration that are best practices when it comes to developing assessments for a program. So let's dig a little deeper and look at the purposes as well as the assessment cycle. So let's start with the purposes of assessment. Now, in the front of each DLG, there will be a chart, and we didn't reproduce that on the screen because it's a full-page chart of recommended assessments for each DLG. And there will be 3 columns, and I will circle back to the nature of those columns in just a minute. But just know that embedded within the program are intentional ways in which you can assess students, and the purposes of those assessments that were recommended are threefold. So let's talk a little bit about the purposes. The first one is what we call assessment of learning. This is probably the type of assessment that we're most familiar with, and we also sometimes refer to this as summative assessment. Some examples would be an end of the unit test, a quiz, when you want to see at the culmination of a certain length of instructional time what students know or are able to do. So assessment of learning. A second purpose of assessment is what we refer to as assessment for learning or formative assessment. And this happens during instruction. Oftentimes it's a very informal way of measuring students' knowledge. Just different types of little activities that you might do with students, discussions, the techniques of like Foursquare, all kinds of different activities that we've suggested on the chart that I referenced in each DLG that are in this category as formative assessments. So again, that principle of ongoing assessment is critical in terms of developing the literacy of our students. And then a third purpose is assessment as learning. And we refer to this also as a self-assessment. So not only is teacher feedback critical during the formative assessment process, but self-assessment, leading students to be able to determine what their own strengths and weaknesses are and what their goals for future learning are, is a whole part of the self-assessment. So 3 very, very significant purposes of assessment that we've integrated within the context of Pathways 2.0. Next. So having said that, having identified the purposes, let's talk about the assessment cycle. Now, thinking back to the chart that I referenced that you find in the front of each DLG, there are 3 columns in that chart. One, the first column is a pre-assessment, a list of things that you can use, different types of assessment tools for assessing each of the instructional blocks. So it's also broken up into the different instructional blocks and what appropriate assessments would be across this particular theme. And then the second column is labeled formative assessments. And there's a list of suggested ways in which you can monitor students' learning during instruction. And these are certainly not an exhaustive list of ways, but a starter for getting you to think a little bit differently, perhaps, of measuring students' progress during the instructional process itself. And the third column are summative assessments. Now, the writers are developing some specific summative assessments for the content of each DLG. So, for example, you'll have, when you teach the comprehension mini lessons during the reading block, the whole group instructional part of the reading block, you will have at the end of the DLG, in probably an appendix, some types of more formal ways of measuring students' comprehension of the content within the context of the anchor text. Another example of a summative assessment is for the grammar mini lessons. There are specific tests, quizzes, whatever you want to call them, that have been developed by the writers to measure students' learning of the grammar elements as well. So again, a real intentional focus in this program about measuring student progress on an ongoing basis with multiple measures and making sure it ties back to the standards and having it inform our instruction. You know, teacher feedback is critical, particularly during the formative assessment process. So, assessment cycle in 3 parts. Next, as a framework for developing the assessments, we've used what we've called the cognitive rigor matrix. And we've also used this for identifying instructional practices as well, but I'm going to speak specifically in regards to its use for assessment. Now, there's not time within the context of this webinar to do justice to this chart, but I want to introduce it, and it's going to be embedded in the teacher's manual, and it's worthy of a webinar of all of its own, but let's hit some highlights here. An individual by the name of Karen Hess developed what is called the cognitive rigor matrix. What she did was she took Bloom's taxonomy, which is on the left-hand side. It's the first column, remember, understand, etc. And she wedded that with Webb's depth of knowledge, which is another way of looking at the way in which we provide instruction and assess. And so if you look across the top where it says level 1, 2, 3, and 4, those are Webb's 4 what he calls depths of knowledge. So sometimes we teach for just recall and reproduction, or sometimes it's about skill and concepts. Going up in levels, sometimes it's more strategic thinking or reasoning, and level 4, extended thinking. Now, it's important to note that one's not better than another. Sometimes it's appropriate to teach to level 1. Sometimes students just need to recall things. But we need to make sure that the different levels that we're teaching or assessing are aligned with the standards. And so if you look at a standard in detail and sort of unpack it and think about the verb in particular that's used in that particular standard, and then plot it on this chart, it will give you some indications of the type of instruction you should be providing so a student can meet that standard, or the way in which you can assess. Now, if you look above the 4 levels at the top, you see where it says selected response, constructed response, and performance response. These are 3 different ways in which to measure students' learning. Selected response, an example would be multiple choice. So if I'm measuring pure recall, I might have a multiple choice question or a true and false question, etc. Constructed response is writing, either brief written responses or sometimes essays. And that would be more appropriate for levels 2 and on into level 3. But a performance response really captures more extended thinking. Can I apply this information, not just recall it? And so this can also be plotted with Bloom's taxonomy in mind as well. There's a crossover between the two. So a very, very critical piece that our writers are using to develop the assessments so that we make sure that our assessments align with the standards. And if you're going to develop your own assessment pieces, this is really information that's of benefit to anyone that's in the process of developing an assessment for learning. So just wanted to share that with you. Again, there's not time to do justice to all the applications of this chart, but it will be embedded in the teacher's manual, and we're using it in a very intentional way to develop our assessment pieces for this program. Cindy now will share some information with us regarding the layout of each DLG.
Okay, thank you. I've chosen just some pages from the grade 2 book, so we can move on to the next slide, please. So the book is Odd Boy Out. This is one of those new books in the Pathways 2.0. I could have chosen pages from different levels, but to sort of see how it progresses through a unit, we are going to just look at grade 2 heroes pages. Next slide, please. So each of the DLGs will have a quite extensive table of contents for each week and each day within that week. So it will be very easy for the teacher to look at the table of contents and go directly to the particular lesson in the particular week that they want to look at. At the beginning of each of the DLGs, there will be an introduction to the anchor text and the unit focus, which is what we're using rather than theme book like we did of the old Pathways. So unit focus will be discussed there. The information about the author of the text, the anchor text, as well as a list of paired texts that are needed or heavily suggested for this week, this book. Then there will be a list of the standards that are addressed, and we'll look a little more about that in just a minute. Also, the list that Carol talked about of the suggested assessments. So this is what the first page of every DLG will be, very similar to this. Unit focus, again, is what we're calling it. The next slide would be good. Thank you. And so then it will have the unit focus, heroes in this case. Every DLG, every unit will have a Bible text. As you see there for heroes, it's Philippians 4:13. That text will be in all 8 grade levels, the same text. And then there will be a synopsis, as we said, of the book. Most often there will also be an image of the book cover for the teacher to reference, and then a little information about the author of the anchor text. Now here you see the paired text, and as was already mentioned, for the paired text, one copy for the teacher per classroom is all that's needed. So these books are not ones that you need to supply a copy for every individual student. Now you'll notice under this list of paired text, by design, the science textbook is referenced. So sometimes these are books that you will already have in your library and are not necessary that you would need to go out and buy new ones. But I would like to say that in many of the DLGs that I've seen so far, there is reference to the by design at some point, especially for the books that are nature, animal oriented and such, and pull in some examples from those from the science textbook, as well as using the science textbook to teach many of the comprehension or text feature lessons. So there's been a deliberate intent to try and utilize other books to teach these reading comprehension skills. Next slide, please. Carol already talked about this, the Adventist viewpoint, worldview, and this will be copied in every DLG, every grade level. Again, this is the one from the Heroes unit. The center graphic will be the same in all of these, but the questions under creation, or the comments I should say, under creation, fall, redemption, and recreation will be adjusted to go with the new unit focus. Next slide, please. This is a shot of the standards addressed page, and I know this is too small for you to read it, but you can see that under the reading foundations, reading informational text, speaking and listening and language, the same categories of standards that are listed in the standard folder will be seen here. Now, if you look at the first one under reading foundation, the whole standard is written there, but the part that's underlined is the part of that standard that is specifically addressed in this unit. So if the standard is not underlined, that's a more global approach in the unit, but when there's only a portion of the standard addressed, that part has been underlined for clarification. Next slide, please. This is part of the suggested assessments chart that Carol was mentioning, and this of course does not include all of the instructional blocks, but I think that you can get a feel for how this is working. For each block, vocabulary, spelling, reading, and so on, there will be a pre-assessment column that Carol mentioned, formative, suggestions for assessment, and then also summative. Now some of these will be the same throughout all the units and grade levels, but often the summative will be much more specific to that particular unit and that particular grade. Sometimes the assessment will be a reference to something that is in the teacher manual, as you can see down on the summative column across from reading, where it talks about using the closed reading scoring guide, which would not be found in the DLG, but instead would be in the teacher manual that was briefly mentioned at the beginning of this session. Next slide, please. For each week of the DLG, there will be a chart that covers well, actually 4 pages, but two-page spreads, which we're calling at a glance. And here will be an excellent place for the teacher to begin their planning for each week, because this will tell you, as you can see here, Under word study, there are two blocks going across the page. Vocabulary is that first row, and then spelling. Now, again, this is for second grade, so there is not a phonics row here, but there would be in the first grade DLGs. You can see that in the far left column, there is the standard for the week, as well as the standard code. Then it goes across for day 1 and day 2, and we'll look at day 3 and day 4 in a minute. But for each day, for each instructional block, there will be an activity name. And usually this is just a brief explanation or a little catchy phrase of what the lesson is going to be doing. Then you'll see resources, and what we have tried to do is to include things that you might need to photocopy for your students, or things that might not normally be accessible in the classroom, to give you a heads up that you need to gather those items together. So for day 1, for example, what you would be needed would be week 3 spelling and vocabulary word cards. Those would be found in Appendix A. Just to clarify about the appendices, Appendix A will include printables and word lists and that sort of thing for spelling and vocabulary for the most part. Appendix B will be including things like handouts. We're calling them printables in the DLGs. Printables for reading comprehension and writing activities. Appendix C will include assessment printables. Appendix D will be answer keys and scoring guides, and Appendix E will be where additional resources for the teacher can be found. Now, you can see that there's the blue row at the top going across for word study. It again reminds you that this block should be about 40 minutes, and then down lower on the page you'll see a block reading workshop, approximately 80 minutes a day. And then down below you see the beginning of the whole group instruction. And then in grades 1 and 2, we're calling it shared read aloud. In grades 3 through 6, that's called interactive read aloud. And then in 7 and 8, it's usually called collaborative discussion. So those are times that are more involving the anchor text for the most part. And, you know, the discussion and question and answers and a lot of listening and speaking goes into that as well. Next slide, please. This is what would be on the facing page of what we were just looking at. So as you move across from one page to the second page on the open spread of the book, here you would also see day 3, day 4, and day 5. Again, this is the word study, spelling, and the whole group instruction for reading, moving across the page. And again, each day has the activity and resources listed. If you look down at day 4, toward the bottom of that column, you'll see that there's a note, this time may be used for completing reading activities as needed. It's suggested that there only be 3 days of shared read aloud and comprehension mini lessons. So often on day 2 and day 4, especially for grades 1 through 4, there may be a note like that. Because some of these lessons you may find that it takes more than the 10 minutes or 15 minutes that we're allowing there to do it, especially for the students to practice that skill. So that day 2 and day 4 most often will have a little note like this. So if you feel overwhelmed that you can't get all of this done on one day, this is another time for you to complete activities that didn't get finished. Next slide, please. So this is from day one of, and I don't recall which week, I'm sorry, it doesn't say the week here, but day one vocabulary. And I just wanted to use this as an example to tell you how it will be, the format will be for each lesson. So you'll notice under word study, that's the main instructional block. There'll be the orangish gold colored text, vocabulary. Then there's the objective stated, as well as the standard. That was also on the at a glance page, but here it is again in the daily lesson. And then whichever words, vocabulary words, are being addressed in this lesson, you will see them as well as a definition of those words before the actual lesson activity is described. Then we have the activity, which is in this case to introduce the anchor text vocabulary. And then you will see there's bulleted statements about planning and going through the lesson. One thing I want to mention here is if you will see down at the bottom of the page where it's suggested to ask the question, what is a question? Then the format we're using for suggested answers is as you see here. It will be in parentheses and it will either indicate that it's a suggested answer, or we're also using the term possible response when it's a little more open-ended. Next slide, please. Here's again an example of a spelling lesson, and one of the things I wanted to bring up here is that often, of course, the words are being sorted. And so here in this lesson, they are being sorted by the vowel consonant or consonant vowel consonant pattern. And we then are including a sample chart, an example of how the sort should be for the teacher to see in the daily lesson guide. Now, because this is second grade, and as Patty mentioned, we are not suggesting that first and second be combined. We don't have the first grade spelling words listed here. But in grades 3 and 4, as well as grades 5 and 6, there will be a spelling lesson for grade 3, for instance, in the grade 3 text, as well as a spelling lesson for grade 4 with their grade 4 words listed. They will do the same activity. For instance, they'll still be sorting, either modeling the sort or repeating the sort or a speed sort or whatever, but the words will be different, and those words will all be included in the daily lesson guide for those multi-grade teachers. Next slide, please. This is an example of a shared read aloud lesson. The thing that I wanted to point out to you here is under the introduce the activity bullet, you'll see example of suggested script. And when the writers have supplied a little narrative to introduce your class or to explain the lesson, then we have bulleted that and put this phrase, example of suggested script, just to give the teacher an idea. But of course, teachers will be able and often will rephrase that into the way that's comfortable for them in their class. Next slide, please. Again, an example of a writing workshop lesson, and you can see some of those things we've talked about. The thing I wanted to show here on this page was down in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see that there is a reduced image of one of the printables. On the just above guided practice, there it says project and distribute copies of the descriptive paragraph, Model 2 printable. And then it says Appendix B, so you know where to go to find it. But over in the right-hand corner there is a reduced image of that printable. So teachers can quickly look at that and find it in the book. It will also be in the appendix. It will also tell you the unit, the week, and the day that it's first used. But this will give the teacher an opportunity to preview the printable and see if they choose to use it or not. Next slide. Again, another example. In the DLG, there will be color. So for instance, in this example chart, in the appendices, however, they will not be. They will all be black and white. Next slide, please. And again, this is just showing you how we don't have a lesson for guided reading, but there is an objective and the reminder about using Reading Aided Z or another format selected by the teacher. Okay, next slide, please. I have just included here a couple of examples of printables from the appendices. This is an example of the spelling and vocabulary words, again for grade 2, and these would then be cut out for the students to use in their sorts throughout the week. Next slide, please. And this is an example of the anchor text vocabulary and the academic vocabulary. Now the whole page wouldn't fit on here well enough for you to read the words, but we have a little coding system so that the teachers and students can keep those words easily separated. So the ATV, anchor text vocabulary, and AV, anchor academic vocabulary, excuse me. All right, next slide, please. This is an example of another printable from Appendix B. They will have an identifying title on the page, usually a place for a name and a date if it's something for the student to complete and turn in, and the directions will be on the page for the student and the teacher. Next slide, please. Then this is just the first page of the Appendix E, which is where teachers will find additional resources. So we have the paired text listed first, and then additional resources that go with this unit focus or with the grammar and writing activities for this unit, and so on. Sometimes there are chapter summaries also included in Appendix E. All right, and I think that's the last slide from mine.
All right, thanks very much, Cindy.
Sure.
So in ending the webinar, we're going to talk just briefly about your responsibilities for the pilot. And so I've already stated the purpose, but let's circle back and reemphasize what the purpose is for the pilot. And that is to get your feedback on the orientation that we have actually provided in this webinar. And so in just a minute, we'll put up the survey that you will fill out at the culmination of the pilot phase. But let's look at the timeline. You're going to be piloting the HEROES unit for the particular grade levels that you teach. And so the anticipation is that you will start that at the beginning of your school year and complete it by October 9. That's sort of our target date. We can be a little flexible there, but just sort of keep in mind as you pace yourself in terms of the implementation of the DLG that you focus on that as a target completion date. Next. This has already been mentioned, but in terms of the grade levels that you teach, if you teach a single grade, you will of course implement the HEROES DLG for that particular grade level. If you teach combo grades, you're going to teach grades 1 and 2 separately, just because of the nature of the skills at those grade levels. But then if you teach combos 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, you'll use the odd-even cycle. So for this next year, that would be grade 4, grade 6, and grade 8. It would be the even year. If you're in a multi-grade setting, again, teach grades 1 and 2 separately, and then also teach odd-even cycle for the other grades, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Next. Here is a shot of the feedback form, the survey that you will complete after you have implemented the HEROES unit or units. And so just take a look at the types of questions that you will be responding to. Of course, the demographic info at the top, but number 3, does this orientation webinar provide you with sufficient information to implement the pilot unit? And number 4, what information that's provided during this webinar is the most useful to you? And number 5, what additional information would have been helpful for implementation? This is critical information that we'll need to plan professional development for teachers at large prior to the full implementation of the program. So we're looking to you to give us some critical pointers in terms of future professional development. Now, Lynn Maloney, who is our representative from Kendall Hunt Publishing, is going to speak briefly on the materials that will be shipped to you. So Lynn, you want to give them an overview of how that is going to take place.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Carol said, my name is Lynn Maloney, and I'm the Senior Creative and Editorial Manager for Kendall Hunt Publishing Company. We're coordinating the pilot test with you, as well as the development of the program with the Seventh-day Adventist group that just did the presentation. So the materials are at the printer as we speak. We've also given you access to the first table of contents and the chapters. That was through an alert you would have received through Google Docs, so you can prep if you want to start looking at those particular grade levels. Then in 2 weeks you will be receiving your packet, realizing that a few of you have already contacted Carol and asked for special shipments and different times to receive the materials. And if that continues, that is okay. Please either contact Carol or myself, and we will coordinate the shipments. They will go directly to the location and addresses that we have received. In the packet you will receive the daily lesson guide, HEROES, for the particular grade level that you're going to teach, as well as the anchor text. And then for those things that you need with the paired text, you'll find a separate envelope, and you'll find 1 copy of the paired text. As Carol had mentioned, when you are finished with the materials, you can contact myself, and we will send you a UPS or FedEx shipping label that you can return those field test copies to Kendall Hunt Publishing Company. Feel free to write in them and mark them up. Now, as far as the actual anchor text is considered, you can keep that book. Those particular copies that you're going to receive may not have the case bindings on them because this is a field test. We didn't go to the extra cost and expense to make those case bound products. But in the final finished goods, when the product is published, all trade books will be available as case bound. And if you have additional questions, either contact Carol and she will communicate that to Kendall Hunt. But again, be looking for those packets here by the end of July. Or again, for those that have asked for special shipments for August, we will follow your instructions.
Okay, thank you very much, Lynn. I don't see any questions that have been posted. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. We thank you for attending this webinar, and hopefully this information will be very beneficial to you as you plan for the piloting of this first unit, HEROES, for the particular grade levels that you're teaching this next year. Thank you to each of the presenters this afternoon as well, and we wish you a restful remainder of the summer and look forward to your feedback in the future as we move forward for planning for future professional development for Pathways 2.0.